Welcome to Black Spring. I know what you're thinking. It's not December 31st. When most people think of New Year's Eve, they imagine new beginnings, health, prosperity, and goodwill towards men. But did you know some of the first ancient New Year's Eve celebrations recorded around 46 BC and evolved through 4000 BC amongst different civilizations? According to Roman religion and mythology, the god Janus possessed standard powers of a god, but namely those of manipulation, beginnings, doors, and gates. He possessed the power to influence the progress and the decisions of human beings. In addition, Janus was depicted with two faces, which allowed him to see the past and the future. Now today, you may not be appearing to be ruled by Roman gods, but by those who have the greatest of influence. They possess the greatest means of wealth and prosperity, and they seem to have a sociological god complex. They don't exactly submit to perspectives of social constructs such as family, schools, and religion. Perhaps, like Roman gods, they disapprove of how we function and humanity's productivity, which causes them to influence the beginnings, openings, and closing of doors, making us less powerful individually and more unlikely to reach our potential. If we appear lacking according to their functionality, a new order for stability and productivity must be established. The pseudo masters of the world usher in something new. We seem to be playing by their rules and their trajectory. Listen to your streets. What do you hear? Silence. There's power in silence. Power is made by power being taken. And ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for joining me on this segment of Black Spring. And today, we begin with a story that's a little bit of beginning of a paradigm, a bit of a centralized paradigm that's being led by children, the Pope, and many more around the globe. I'd like to thank everybody for joining me on this segment of Black Spring. Now, this segment of this story comes from the vetted source, The New American. It's entitled, On Earth Day, the Pope Rebukes Humanity and Calls for, quote, ecological conversion, end quote. Now, this is written by Luis Miguel. Yeah, do a bit of paraphrasing here. Pope Francis had strong words for humanity on Earth Day, rebuking mankind for its collective failure to take care of the planet during a Wednesday video stream. Quote, because of our selfishness, we have failed in our responsibility to be guardians and stewards of the earth, the pontiff said in his address. Quote, we need only take a frank look at the facts to see that our common home is falling into a serious disrepair, end quote. Pope Francis, who has made environmentalism one of the hallmark issues of his papacy and heaped praise on teenage climate change activist Greta Thunberg, accused humans of having, quote, polluted and despoiled, quote, the earth. Quote, for this reason, various international and local movements have sprung up in order to appeal to our consciences, end quote, he added, perhaps an allusion to groups such as Thunberg's Fridays for Future, as well as the United Nations. The Pope spoke at the UN Assembly in 2015, shortly before member states unanimously adopted Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, which he called, quote, a great step forward for global dialogue, marking a vitality, new and university solidarity, end quote. Quote, I deeply appreciate these initiatives. Still, it will be necessary for our children to take to the streets to teach us the obvious. We have no future if we destroy the very environment that sustains us, end quote. The pontiff continued. We have failed to care for the earth, our garden home. We have failed to care for our brothers and our sisters. We have sinned against the earth, against our neighbors, and ultimately against the Creator, the benevolent Father who provides for everyone and desires us to live in communion and flourish together. As if treating the earth as a sentient entity in parity with God Himself weren't enough, Pope Francis went on to call on his listeners to undergo a, quote, ecological conversion. Quote, we cannot heal the earth unless we love and respect it, end quote, he declared. The Pope also touted two upcoming environmental conferences, the COP15 on biodiversity in Kunming, China, and COP26 on climate change in Glasgow, Scotland, both products of the UN. Though these conferences ostensibly deal with climate change, they, like climate agenda in general, as evidenced by the Green New Deal's focus on sweeping economic, social, and radical reform, use the environment as a springboard to promote a variety of socialist and globalist causes. At the COP25 on climate change, for instance, the convening parties deliberated matters such as, quote, human rights, the right to health, the rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities, and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, end quote. The Pope concluded, quote, in this Easter season of renewal, let us pledge to love and esteem the beautiful gift of the earth, our common home, and to care for all members of our human family, end quote. Pope Francis had become known for mixing the spiritual and with the political, frequently using the pulpit to advance left-wing causes, particularly climate change and migration. Last Christmas, he compared President Trump to the wicked King Herod from the Bible. He previously asserted that, quote, a person who only thinks about building walls, wherever they may be, and not building bridges is not Christian, end quote. And in December, the Pope erected a migrant crucifix in the Vatican, replacing the body of Christ on the cross with a migrant life vest. Pope Francis is also a critic of capitalism, writing of the free market in an apostolic exhortation. Some people continue to defend trickle-down theories, which assume that economic growth, encouraged by free market, will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of prevailing economic system. Pontiff wasn't the only public figure to preach environmentalism on Earth Day. Former President Barack Obama crept out of his hiding place Wednesday to proclaim that climate change will be, quote, far harsher on humanity than COVID-19 pandemic. Barack Obama's tweet is provided, quote, that we have all had to adapt to cope with the pandemic. Climate change will force harsher changes on our kids. All of us should follow the young people who have led efforts to protect our planet for generations and demand more of our leaders at every level. Greta Thunberg paired the two objects of fear, climate change and the pandemic, saying that they must be tackled together. Quote, we need to tackle two crises at once, the teenager stated. Her comments echoed those of the UN chief Antonio Guterres, formerly the president of the Socialist International, who on Earth Day urged governments to use the pandemic to address the even deeper emergency of climate change. It's not surprising that Guterres should be vocal on Earth Day. After all, the quote holiday is a United Nations creation first proposed by UNESCO in 1969. What is tragic is that millions of faithful Christians eager to hear the gospel are instead being given social gospel and indoctrinated with the new religion of climate alarmism instead of Catholicism, which has ultimately been resolute in its opposition to socialism as evil, or even Christianity in general, which calls for people not to covet thy neighbor's goods or steal, even you believe it's for a good cause. I'd like to thank everybody for joining me on this segment of Black Spring with Autumn. Now here we have a bit of a few elements here that we've seen play out before, and it's ultimately a part of the UN agenda. We have generally the Pope serving as him offering his words and pretty much a conversion. He's calling for a conversion, and it's more of a climate faith, a climate loyalty. It's a sustainability cry. It's all the things that appeals to, or that you might see on a left agenda, or in perhaps even a leftist wish list. And these are goals of the UN Agenda 2030. They, of course, are subscribing to their conflict theories, and, of course, looking for inequities, scrutinizing capitalism, even though they need capitalism to sustain their agendas, to fund their agendas. But that's what the Pope is using. He's utilizing this Earth Day to campaign for UN Agenda 2030, which also entails wealth redistribution, more social protections, essentially a centralized world or centralized paradigm. And of course, it's all sponsored by the UN. So the other example here that we've seen is the children being used as what the UN refers to as an agent of change. In fact, Time magazine made Greta Thunberg their agent of change, and AKA referred to her or named her as Time magazine's Person of the Year in 2019. So, we've got a couple of campaigns running side by side, and of course, the logic here is revealing the logic behind or the contributor to the pandemic seems to be wrapped up in climate change. And the Earth is not happy with us because we have not conformed to the UN agenda and their financial agenda. So, love to know what you think about the Pope's call for a conversion that's generally climate change, that involves climate change and climate funding and sustainability goals that are all outlined in the UN Agenda 2030. Let me know what you think, what your concerns and what your comments are. And if you could hit the like, subscribe, or share button, and let me know what you think about this climate faith. And I don't know, not sure, maybe where do you stand? Are you looking for a conversion, or are you unsure of what he's calling for? And as always, I'd like to thank everybody for joining me on this segment of Black Spring with Autumn.